Welcome to True Stories 102. Today we share the remarkable journey of Jamie, a compassionate young student who once faced unfair treatment from his teacher, Mrs. Parker, at Lincoln Middle School. A year later, destiny brings them back together, under unexpected and challenging circumstances. Watch as Jamie chooses forgiveness and extends a helping hand to a struggling Mrs. Parker, sparking a heartwarming transformation for both of them and their entire school community. Will compassion truly heal old wounds and create a lasting change? Tune in to discover this inspiring tale of redemption and the power of kindness. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. Let's start following this fascinating story. The morning sun poured through the windows of room 305 at Lincoln Middle School, casting long shadows on the freshly cleaned floors. Jamie sat quietly at his desk, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his new notebook. His brown eyes took in every detail of the classroom, from the colorful posters on the walls to the neat rows of empty chairs slowly filling up with his new classmates. This was Jamie's first day at Lincoln, and everything felt different from his old school. The hallways were wider, the lockers were a bright shade of green, and the air smelled fresh, like a mix of new books and school lunch. Jamie reached up to touch his hair, carefully styled in a neat curl that his mother had helped maintain just yesterday. "You look great," she had said, her warm smile giving him the confidence he needed for this new start. What none of his classmates knew, and what the school staff hadn't been told, was that Jamie's father was actually the new principal, Mr. Davis. It had been a family decision to keep this connection secret, at least for the first few weeks. "Give yourself a chance to make friends on your own terms," his dad had suggested over breakfast that morning, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror before they left home. As students filed into the classroom, Jamie noticed how they naturally formed their usual groups, friends who'd known each other since kindergarten, sharing summer stories and comparing class schedules. He pulled out his notebook, the fresh pages ready for a new start. Just as his teacher walked in, Mrs. Parker, Jamie felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Mrs. Parker stood at the front of the class, her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, and her eyes kind but focused. She began taking attendance, her gaze scanning the room as she called out each name. When she reached Jamie's, there was a slight pause, a barely noticeable shift in her expression that only someone watching closely would catch. Throughout that first morning, Jamie tried his best to blend in. He raised his hand when he knew the answers, kept quiet when he didn't, and followed every instruction carefully. But he couldn't help noticing how Mrs. Parker's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, how her smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to him. During their first writing assignment, Jamie worked carefully on his summer vacation essay. He wrote about the family trip to the national park, the hikes they'd taken, and his dream of becoming a wildlife biologist someday. When he handed in his paper, Mrs. Parker barely glanced at it before placing it at the bottom of the pile. At lunch break, a friendly girl named Mia invited Jamie to sit with her and her friends. They talked about video games, their favorite subjects, and the upcoming school science fair. For a moment, Jamie felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe this new school wouldn't be so bad after all. But when they returned to class, he noticed Mrs. Parker watching him with that same strange look as she handed back the graded morning assignments. Jamie saw the red marks scattered across his paper like angry scratches, the grade at the top. ACE made his heart sink. He'd never gotten anything lower than a BU before. Looking around, he saw other students comparing their grades, most of them as in BS. Mia, who sat next to him, had written a similar-length essay about her summer at dance camp and received an A. Jamie swallowed hard and tucked the paper into his folder, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach as the afternoon wore on. Small incidents began to pile up. Mrs. Parker interrupted him twice while he was answering questions, something she didn't do with other students. When he asked to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait until 3 other students had gone first. During art period, she walked past his desk without offering help. even though she stopped to assist every other student in his row. The final bell couldn't come soon enough. As Jamie packed up his books, he thought about whether to tell his father about his day. He knew his dad would want to know if something was bothering him. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe Mrs. Parker was just having a bad day. Maybe he was imagining things. Walking down the hallway toward the exit, Jamie passed his father's office. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Mr. Davis in an animated discussion with another teacher. His dad caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging nod. Jamie managed a small smile in return, clutching his backpack a little tighter. That evening at home, when his mother asked about his first day, Jamie kept his answer simple. It was okay. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at his ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something more challenging than he'd expected. Still, his mother's words echoed in his mind. Stay strong, Jamie. Be proud of who you are. Weeks passed at Lincoln Middle School, and the crisp autumn air brought changes to more than just the leaves. Inside room 305, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Jamie had settled into a routine, but Mrs. Parker's behavior toward him had become impossible to ignore, even for his classmates. One morning, while Jamie was solving a math problem at the board, Mrs. Parker stood behind him, tapping her foot impatiently. We don't have all day, she said, her voice sharp enough to make several students look up from their notebooks. Jamie's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the final answer, which was perfectly correct. But Mrs. Parker merely said, sit down, without acknowledging his work. During the same class, when another student, Ethan, solved a similar problem more slowly and made 2 mistakes, Mrs. Parker's voice turned honey-sweet. Take your time, Ethan. Math can be tricky, but you're doing just fine. The contrast was stark. Mia, Jamie's friend, shot him a concerned look from across the room. At lunch that day, Mia finally spoke up. Our teacher is treating Jamie differently, she said, pushing her apple around her tray. Teachers aren't supposed to treat kids like that. Jamie just shrugged, trying to seem unbothered, but inside, his stomach was in knots. The situation reached a new level during their history presentations. Each student had to talk about their family heritage. When Jamie proudly shared stories about his mother's volunteer work and his family's deep roots in the community, Mrs. Parker interrupted him halfway through. That's enough, she cut in. We need to give others a chance. When the next student spoke for an extra few minutes about their summer vacations, completely off topic, Mrs. Parker beamed and called it wonderfully detailed. Her behavior began spreading beyond room 305. Other teachers noticed how she would make comments about Jamie's hair during faculty lunch breaks. I don't understand why they can't just let the kids wear their hair normally, she'd say loudly enough for several teachers to hear. Most shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but few spoke up. Mr. Lee, the science teacher, was one of the few who showed obvious concern. He started finding reasons to walk past room 305 during Mrs. Parker's class. Once, he even stepped in to borrow some markers right after hearing Mrs. Parker's raised voice through the door. His presence seemed to temporarily calm things down, but he couldn't always be there. One day, while grading papers, Mrs. Parker made a show of holding Jamie's essay at an awkward angle, as if it might bite her. Your handwriting is absolutely impossible to read, she announced to the class, even though Jamie's writing was as neat as any other student. She marked it with a D, despite Mia later saying it was one of the best essays she'd read. Other students started noticing patterns too. How Mrs. Parker would wrinkle her nose when walking past Jamie's desk. How she'd ignore his raised hand in class discussions. And how she'd blame him for any noise in the classroom, even when he was quietly reading. Even students began standing up for Jamie in their own small ways. They purposely pointed out when he knew the right answer or asked him for help with their homework. Some even started wearing their hair in different styles in solidarity, though none of them fully understood the deeper significance of what was happening. Jamie's performance in other classes remained excellent. In Mr. Lee's science class, he was thriving. His experiments were always thorough and creative. In art class, his projects were displayed in the hallway. In P, he was picked first for teams, but in Mrs. Parker's class, his grades kept mysteriously dropping. At home, Jamie started having trouble sleeping. He'd lie awake, replaying answers to simple questions, terrified of making even the smallest mistake in class. His mother noticed he was quieter at dinner, pushing food around his plate instead of sharing stories about his day like he used to. Each morning, as Jamie walked to school, he'd see his father's car already in the parking lot. He knew Dad was working hard to improve the school, holding meetings about inclusive education and student welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he still couldn't bring himself to speak up about what was happening in room 305. Mrs. Parker's recent parent-teacher conferences had raised eyebrows. Parents reported that she seemed to have two entirely different demeanors, warmly praising some students while finding endless faults with others. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone, except those who could actually do something about it. The tension was building like a pot about to boil over. Other teachers exchanged worried glances in the hallway. Students whispered among themselves. Even the school secretary had started keeping a sublog of incidents she overheard. Everyone could sense that something would have to give, but they just didn't know what or when. Through it all, Jamie held on to his mother's words about dignity and strength. Each morning he walked into class with his head high, his homework complete, and his spirit unbroken. But even the strongest spirit can only bend so far before something has to change. And change was coming to room 305 sooner than anyone expected. The art room buzzed with excitement on that Wednesday afternoon. Colorful posters for the upcoming fall festival covered one wall, and the warm October sun painted golden squares on the floor through the big windows. Students chattered quietly as they worked on their craft projects, creating decorations for the school hallways. Jamie sat at his usual spot, carefully cutting orange paper into perfect pumpkin shape. His project was coming along nicely. He'd already finished 2 pumpkins and was working on a third. Next to him, Mia was struggling with her scissors, creating what she claimed was a modern art interpretation of a full leaf. Mrs. Parker moved between the desks, carrying a box of craft supplies. She'd been unusually quiet that day, her lips pressed into a thin line as she handed out materials. When she reached Jamie's desk, she paused longer than necessary, staring at his neatly arranged workspace. "I see you're actually following instructions for once," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge that made Jamie's shoulders tense. He kept his eyes on his work, pretending to focus on getting the curve of the pumpkin stem just right. A few students nearby looked up, then quickly looked away. They'd grown used to these moments of tension, but that didn't make them any easier to witness. "We need some glue over here," called a voice from the back of the room. Mrs. Parker turned away, and Jamie let out a small breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached for his water bottle, taking a sip to calm his nerves. The next few minutes passed peacefully. Jamie finished his third pumpkin and started working on a border design for his display. The classroom chatter had returned to its normal level, filled with discussions about weekend plans and the upcoming science fair. Then he felt something cold and wet on the top of his head. For a split second, Jamie thought someone had spilled water. But the sensation was different, thicker and stickier. His heart started racing as he reached up to touch his hair. Mrs. Parker stood behind him, an open bottle in her hand. The strong chemical smell hit his nose before his fingers confirmed what had happened. Super glue. Not the washable craft glue they'd been using for their projects, but industrial-strength super glue from the supply cabinet. The room fell dead silent. Someone gasped. A pencil clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Oh my," Mrs. Parker said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." Jamie sat frozen, his hands still touching the sticky mess in his hair. His carefully maintained curls, the ones his mother had helped him style since he was little, were now glued together with fast-drying adhesive. From somewhere behind him came the distinctive sound of phone cameras clicking. Then another. Mrs. Parker's face changed for just a moment, a flicker of something like panic crossing her features. "I'll get some paper towels," she said, turning away. But everyone in the room knew paper towels wouldn't fix this. Super glue wasn't like regular glue. It couldn't just be washed out. Mia stood up from her seat. "I'm getting the nurse," she announced, her voice shaking slightly with anger. Before Mrs. Parker could object, Mia was out the door. Other students started moving too. Emma, who sat in front of Jamie, gathered her courage and spoke up. "That wasn't the wrong bottle," she said clearly. "The craft glue is in the plastic bottles with the orange caps. That's the super glue from the locked cabinet." More students joined in, their voices overlapping. "You had to use the key to get that." One said, "I saw you take it out before class. You didn't even try to help other students with glue." Mrs. Parker's face went pale. She must have realized too late how many witnesses were in the room. How many phones had captured what happened? How many students were finally finding their voices? Jamie still hadn't moved. The glue was starting to harden, pulling uncomfortably at his scalp. But somehow, sitting there in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. The fear and anxiety of the past weeks transformed into something else. A quiet strength. A certainty that this time, things would have to change. Through the open classroom door came the sound of running footsteps. The nurse would be arriving soon, and with her, the questions would begin. What happened? Who was responsible? Why? And somewhere in the building, Jamie's father was in his office, unaware that his role as principal was about to collide with his role as a parent in a way that would change everything. Mrs. Parker stood by her desk, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to make a show of looking for paper towels. But the evidence was clear. The super glue bottle still in her hand. The security camera in the corner of the room. The dozens of students who had witnessed everything, and the determination in their eyes that said this time they wouldn't stay silent. The school nurse's office was usually quiet during the afternoon hours, but not today. The news spread through the building like wildfire, carried in whispered conversations and urgent text messages. Students passing by the office slowed their steps, trying to catch glimpses through the frosted glass window. Inside, Nurse Baker worked carefully with warm water and gentle hands, doing her best to assess the damage to Jamie's hair. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed her anger as she documented everything with her phone camera, taking pictures for the inevitable investigation. "It's starting to burn a little," Jamie said quietly, wincing as Nurse Baker touched a particularly sticky spot. The chemical smell of the super glue filled the small room, mixing with the usual antiseptic scent. Outside in the hallway, Mia paced back and forth. She'd appointed herself guardian of the door, turning away curious onlookers while waiting for the principal to arrive. Several other students from the art class had followed her to the nurse's office, forming a protective circle. They were busy sending video clips they'd captured to each other, making sure multiple copies existed. Mrs. Parker stood awkwardly by the wall. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She kept smoothing her skirt with shaking hands, jumping slightly every time footsteps passed by the door. "It was an accident," she repeated to nobody in particular. "Just a simple mix-up with the bottles." Emma, who had stayed to give her account, spoke up from her chair. "The craft glue is in plastic bottles," she said again, her voice stronger now. "The super glue is kept in the locked cabinet. You needed the key to get it." The nurse paused in her work, looking directly at Mrs. Parker. "Super glue can cause chemical burns," she said, her professional tone carrying an edge of steel. "This isn't a simple mix-up. This is serious." Just then, the door opened. Everyone expected to see Principal Davis, but it was Mr. Lee, the science teacher, who rushed in. He took one look at Jamie and the bottle of super glue on the counter, and his face darkened without a word. He pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly. "The principal is in a district meeting," he explained. "I sent him an urgent message. He should be here any minute." He didn't know. None of them knew just how personal this message would be for the principal. The minutes ticked by slowly. Mrs. Baker continued her gentle work, documenting everything. Mr. Lee stood by the door, his usually cheerful face set in serious lines. More teachers had gathered in the hallway, their murmured conversations carrying tones of shock and concern. Then came the sound of quick, purposeful footsteps in the hallway. The crowd outside parted, and the door opened. Principal Davis stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. For a moment, everything froze. Mrs. Parker's face went chalk white as recognition dawned in her eyes. She looked from Jamie to the principal and back again, the connection finally clicking into place. The same warm brown eyes, the same straight nose, the same quiet dignity. How had she never noticed? "Dad," Jamie said softly, and the single word seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Principal Davis's face underwent a remarkable transformation. For a split second, raw pain and fury flashed across his features as he looked at his son. Then, with visible effort, he pulled his professional mask back into place. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly controlled but vibrating with authority. "Nurse Baker, please continue helping my son," he said. "Mr. Lee, would you please call the district office? We need a substitute teacher immediately." He turned to Mrs. Parker, who had pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. "Mrs. Parker, please go to my office and wait there." The students watched in awe as their principal managed this crisis with calm efficiency. Even while his own child sat there with chemicals burning his scalp, he made calls, documented everything, and ensured proper procedures were followed, all while checking on Jamie every few minutes with concerned glances. Parents began arriving, called by their children's texts and messages. They gathered in the front office, their angry voices carrying down the hallway. The school secretary was fielding constant phone calls, and the superintendent herself was on her way. Through it all, Jamie sat quietly in the nurse's office, holding an ice pack to his burning scalp. He watched his father navigate this impossible situation, being both a parent and a principal, and felt a new kind of pride growing inside him. The secret they had kept for weeks had finally come out, but not in any way they could have imagined. By late afternoon, the hallways had cleared, but the story was far from over. Social media was already buzzing with the news. Community leaders were calling for action, and the school board was scheduling an emergency meeting. Father and son finally had a moment alone. Principal Davis pulled up a chair next to Jamie, his professional facade cracking slightly as he gently touched his son's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I had no idea things had gotten this bad." Jamie looked up at his father, seeing the pain and determination in his eyes. "I know, Dad," he replied. "But now everyone else knows too. Maybe that's what needed to happen." As the evening set outside, casting long shadows across the nurse's office floor, both father and son knew that tomorrow would bring challenges they'd have to face together. But for now, they sat in quiet understanding, their shared strength growing in the silence. The next morning arrived with a sense of urgency that hung in the air like storm clouds. Principal Davis sat in his office, his desk covered with papers and his phone buzzing constantly with messages and calls. The morning news vans were already parked outside the school gates, their satellite dishes reaching into the gray sky. In the conference room down the hall, Mrs. Parker sat alone, staring at her hands. She had been there since dawn, watching through the window as teachers and staff arrived. Their faces were groomed with concern, and she knew her 20-year teaching career was probably over. The superintendent, Dr. Collins, arrived first. Her usually pristine suit was slightly rumpled from rushing to get there. She had been up most of the night dealing with press inquiries and angry emails from parents. As she walked through the main office, the secretary handed her a thick folder with printed copies of all the complaints that had been filed against Mrs. Parker over the years. "How did we miss this?" Dr. Collins muttered, flipping through the pages. There were incidents dating back 5 years, subtle discrimination, unexplained grade changes, complaints that had been filed and somehow forgotten. The pattern was clear now, but only because someone had finally connected all the dots. The school board members arrived one by one, their faces serious as they were escorted to the conference room. Each had watched the video that had gone viral overnight, shaky phone footage that showed Mrs. Parker deliberately pouring super glue onto Jamie's hair. The timestamps and multiple angles left no room for doubt. Principal Davis stood at his office window watching more cars pull into the parking lot. Community leaders, civil rights advocates, and parents were gathering, presenting a clear message that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. His phone buzzed again with a message from his wife, saying she'd taken Jamie to the doctor to check for any chemical burns. A soft knock at his door made him turn. Mr. Lee stood there holding a stack of papers. "Sir," he said quietly, placing the papers on the desk. "The students wanted you to have these." Dozens of written statements from students in Mrs. Parker's class detailed incidents they'd witnessed over the past weeks. Each described how Mrs. Parker had picked on Jamie, altered his grades, and made him feel unwelcome. Principal Davis read each statement carefully, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his son had endured this treatment. While he worked just down the hall, unaware, his professional distance had unknowingly given Mrs. Parker the space to act without consequence. At 10:00 sharp, the conference room doors closed for the emergency board meeting. Mrs. Parker sat at one end of the long table, her lawyer beside her, while board members filled the other seats. Dr. Collins stood at the front of the room, the video playing silently on the screen behind her. "We're here today," she began, her voice firm, "to address an incident that has revealed serious flaws in our system. Mrs. Parker," she continued, turning to her, "would you like to explain your action?" Mrs. Parker's lawyer leaned forward to whisper something, but she shook her head. The mask of innocence she'd worn for so long had cracked completely. "I didn't know he was the principal's son," she said, as if that somehow explained everything. A board member spoke up, his voice sharp. "Would it have made a difference if you had known? Would that have made you treat him with basic human dignity?" The meeting continued for hours. Every complaint was reviewed, every incident discussed. Teachers came forward with their own observations, speaking about comments Mrs. Parker had made in the break room and attitudes they'd noticed, but hadn't challenged strongly enough. Outside the school, the conversation had become part of a larger movement. News reporters interviewed parents and community members, all demanding change. Social media was flooded with support for Jamie and his father, with many people sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd faced in schools. By late afternoon, decisions had been made. Mrs. Parker's employment was terminated immediately. The board announced a full review of all complaint procedures and the implementation of mandatory bias training for all staff. But everyone knew these were just the first steps in addressing a much deeper problem. Principal Davis spent the rest of the day in meetings with district officials, civil rights advocates, and parent representatives. They discussed changes in policy, new training programs, and ways to create a more inclusive school environment. His dual role as administrator and parent gave him a unique perspective that many found valuable. As the day drew to a close, he finally had a moment to check his phone. There was a message from his wife. "Jamie is doing okay." The doctor treated some minor chemical irritation but found no serious burns. More importantly, he's holding his head high and refusing to let this incident break his spirit. The last person to leave the school that evening was the janitor, who paused in his work to watch Principal Davis standing in the empty hallway. The principal was looking at the student artwork on the walls. Bright, colorful pieces that showed the diversity of the school community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in the quiet of the empty school, he could begin to plan for the changes that would ensure no child ever felt unsafe or unwelcome in these halls again. Walking to his car under the darkening sky, Principal Davis thought about how sometimes the hardest lessons come from the most painful experiences. The school would never be the same after today, and maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. 1 week after the incident, the school board hearing room was packed to capacity. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces both familiar and new. At the front, board members sat behind a long table, their expressions serious as they prepared to address the overflowing crowd. Jamie sat between his parents in the front row, his hair carefully covered with a soft cap. The chemical burns had mostly healed, but the damage to his locks had required careful treatment at a specialized salon. His mother sat next to him, her presence a pillar of strength for the whole family. Dr. Collins, the superintendent, stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. What happened at Lincoln Middle School was not just an isolated incident. She began, her voice clear and determined. It was a wake-up call for our entire district. Behind her, a screen displayed statistics that made many in the audience gasp. Complaints about discriminatory behavior had been filed in schools across the district, but most had been handled quietly or filed away without proper follow-up. The superglue incident had finally forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system had failed too many students for too long. Mrs. Parker sat with her lawyer at a small table to the side, her face aged years in just a week. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Not just the viral video, but years of documented incidents that had come to light. Former students had come forward with their own stories, painting a picture of long-term discriminatory behavior that could no longer be ignored. The board's decision was unanimous. Mrs. Parker's teaching license would be revoked, and the district would cooperate fully with ongoing investigations by civil rights organizations. More importantly, sweeping changes would be implemented across all schools. "We're establishing an independent review board," Dr. Collins announced. "Any complaints of discrimination will be investigated immediately. We're implementing new training programs, revising our hiring practices, and creating student-led diversity councils in every school." Principal Davis was called to speak next. He stood at the podium, looking both professional and deeply personal as he addressed the crowd. "As an educator and a father, I've seen this issue from both sides. We need to do better, and we will do better." He outlined plans for Lincoln Middle School that would serve as a model for others. Regular cultural sensitivity training for all staff, a new curriculum that celebrated diversity, an anonymous reporting system for students who felt unsafe, and monthly meetings where students could speak directly with administrators about their concerns. Community leaders stepped up to support these changes. Local businesses offered to fund new programs. Civil rights organizations volunteered to provide training, and parents formed committees to help implement the new policies. What had started as a terrible incident was transforming into a movement for positive change. Jamie listened quietly between his parents. He thought about his friends at school, how they had stood up for him when it mattered most. He thought about Mr. Lee, who had been keeping an eye out all along. He thought about all the students who might have a better school experience because of what happened. During a break in the proceedings, a young student approached Jamie. "My little sister is starting school next year," she said softly. "Thanks to you, she'll be safer." Jamie managed a small smile, realizing that his painful experience might help protect others. The hearing continued into the afternoon. Lawyers discussed legal implications. Teachers proposed changes to classroom policies, and students shared their own experiences and ideas for making schools more inclusive. Every voice was heard, every suggestion considered. Principal Davis watched it all from his seat, taking careful notes. He had already started implementing changes at Lincoln Middle School. The art supplies were now stored in clear containers, properly labeled and accessible to all students. Teachers were required to document their grading processes, and a new counselor had been hired specifically to support students who faced discrimination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, the board made their final announcements. Mrs. Parker would never teach again. The district would pay for Jamie's medical treatment and hair restoration. New policies would be implemented before the next school year began. But the most significant change wasn't written in any official document. It was in the way people looked at each other now, with more understanding and awareness. It was in the conversations happening in hallways and classrooms, at dinner tables, and in community meetings. Walking out of the hearing room, Jamie felt different. The cap on his head still hid the damage to his hair, but he held his head high. His father's hand rested on his shoulder. "You did good, son," Principal Davis said quietly as they walked to their car. "Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes." Jamie nodded. thinking about all the other students who would benefit from these new policies. The incident had been painful, but the response from his school and community had shown him something powerful. When people stand together against injustice, real change is possible. That evening, as news crews packed up their equipment and the last cars left the parking lot, the setting sun painted the school board building in shades of gold. Inside, custodians cleaned the hearing room while board members finalized paperwork. Outside, new signs were already being installed. Lincoln Middle School, where every student belongs. 6 months after the incident, Lincoln Middle School had transformed. The hallways buzzed with new energy as students hurried to their morning classes. Fresh paint brightened the walls, now covered with student artwork, celebrating diversity and inclusion. But the real changes went much deeper than surface appearances. Jamie walked confidently through the main entrance, his locks healthy and restored thanks to the careful work of his mother's friend, a specialist who had helped repair the damage. Students greeted him with warm smiles and fist bumps as he made his way to his locker. Gone was the nervous boy who had started the school year. In his place stood a young leader who had helped shape positive change. The morning announcements crackled over the speaker system, reminding everyone about the upcoming Unity Fair. Jamie smiled, remembering how the idea had started in one of the new student council meetings. The fair would showcase different cultures, traditions, and stories from the school community. His project, a presentation about the history and significance of different hairstyles, had already generated a lot of interest. Principal Davis stood in the hallway watching the students pass by. The past months had been challenging but rewarding. The new policies weren't just papers in a file. They were making real differences in students' lives. The anonymous reporting system had already prevented several incidents of discrimination. Teachers were more aware, more engaged, and more willing to speak up when they saw problems. In the teachers' lounge, the atmosphere had changed too. The new diversity training coordinator led weekly discussion groups where staff could openly talk about their biases and learn from each other. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary. Several teachers had admitted that watching Mrs. Parker's downfall had made them examine their own unconscious prejudices. Mia, now president of the new Student Diversity Council, caught up with Jamie at lunch. "You're still coming to speak at the elementary school next week, right?" she asked, sliding into his seat. The council has started a mentoring program, visiting younger students to talk about inclusion and standing up against discrimination. "I wouldn't miss it," Jamie replied, thinking about how much he had grown since that terrible day in art class. Speaking up had been hard at first, but now he understood the power of his voice. Other students had started sharing their stories too, creating a ripple effect of awareness and change throughout the district. The superintendent's new policies had spread to other schools in the area. Lincoln Middle School had become a model, hosting educators from other districts who wanted to learn from their experience. Principal Davis often gave presentations, sharing both the professional and personal aspects of their journey toward real inclusion. In the afternoon, Jamie attended one of the new after-school workshops. Today's session focused on cultural exchange, with students teaching each other about their family's traditions. The room was packed. These voluntary sessions had become surprisingly popular, with students genuinely interested in learning about their classmates' backgrounds. Mr. Lee, who now headed the school's inclusion committee, watched from the doorway with satisfaction. "You know," he said to Principal Davis, who had stopped to observe, "when I first started teaching here, I never thought I'd see changes like this." Later that day, Jamie sat in his father's office, helping to review suggestions from the anonymous feedback box. They did this every week, taking each comment seriously. "Look at this one," Jamie said, holding up a note. "They want to start a monthly cultural heritage celebration." His father nodded, adding it to their growing list of student-led initiatives. The school has learned that the best ideas often come from the students themselves. As the day drew to a close, Jamie packed up his books, pausing to look at the new mural in the main hallway. Painted by students over several weekends, it showed a diverse group of young people standing together, their differences celebrated rather than hidden. He remembered how the whole school had contributed ideas for the design, making it truly representative of their community. Walking home with his father, Jamie noticed a moving truck outside the school. "The last of Mrs. Parker's things," Principal Davis explained quietly. "The former teacher has left the state, but her actions have sparked changes that will continue to impact students for years to come." That evening, at a community dinner celebrating the school's progress, Jamie stood to speak, looking out at the faces of his classmates, teachers, and neighbors. He saw something that hadn't been there 6 months ago: real understanding, genuine connection, and shared purpose. "What happened to me was painful," he said, his voice clear and strong. "But look at what we've built from it. Every student who walks through these doors now knows they belong here. Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard." The applause that followed wasn't just for Jamie. It was for every person who had helped transform a moment of hatred into a movement of hope. As the sun set outside, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Lincoln Middle School stood as a testament to what could happen when a community refused to let discrimination win, choosing instead to grow, learn, and change together. 6 months later, Lincoln Middle School had fully embraced its new identity. The Unity Fair was a huge success, with booths representing different cultures, traditional dances, and delicious foods from around the world. Jamie's presentation on hairstyles was one of the highlights, earning him praise from students and teachers alike. The Student Diversity Council had grown, with more members each month. They organized events, workshops, and support groups, ensuring that every student felt seen and valued. The anonymous reporting system proved effective, with several incidents being addressed before they could escalate. Principal Davis continued to lead with compassion and integrity, always open to feedback, and dedicated to maintaining the inclusive environment they had worked so hard to create. His relationship with Jamie had grown stronger, built on mutual respect and understanding. Jamie often thought about the day everything changed. The day Mrs. Parker had tried to hurt him, but he no longer saw it as just a painful memory. It was a turning point that led to meaningful change, not just for him, but for everyone at Lincoln Middle School. As he walked through the hallways, now filled with vibrant artwork and messages of unity, Jamie felt proud of how far they had come. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was confident that together they could overcome anything. And so, Lincoln Middle School thrived, a beacon of hope and progress, showing that with courage, resilience, and community support, real change is always possible. One crisp autumn afternoon, exactly 1 year after the incident that had changed Lincoln Middle School forever, Jamie walked through the familiar hallways with a sense of accomplishment. The school had transformed into a vibrant community where every student felt valued and heard. The Unity Fair had become an annual tradition, eagerly anticipated by everyone. Jamie, now a respected member of the Student Diversity Council, felt proud of the positive changes he had helped foster. As he approached the art room, Jamie noticed something different. The once bustling classroom was unusually quiet, and a few concerned faces from the student council were gathered outside the door. Curiosity piqued. He knocked gently and pushed the door open. Inside, he saw Mrs. Parker sitting alone at her desk, her head bowed and shoulders slumped. Her usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Her hair was unkempt, and her clothes looked worn and faded. The room felt heavy with sadness. Jamie felt a pang of empathy as he took in the sight of his former teacher. Memories of the painful year rushed back. How Mrs. Parker had singled him out, the fear he had felt, and the support he had received from his friends and the school staff. But now, seeing her in such a state, Jamie realized that the tables had turned in ways he hadn't imagined. "Mrs. Parker," Jamie said softly, stepping into the room. His voice carried a mixture of concern and compassion. She looked up, startled by his presence. Her eyes, once sharp and cold, now seemed hollow and weary. "Jamie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamie approached her desk and took a seat opposite her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Mrs. Parker sighed deeply, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Not really," she admitted. "Everything has fallen apart since I lost my job. I've been struggling to make ends meet and I don't know what to do anymore." Jamie felt his heart ache for her. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't bring himself to hold on to anger or resentment. Instead, he saw the pain and desperation in her eyes and felt a deep sense of compassion. "I'm really sorry, Mrs. Parker," Jamie said sincerely. "I know things have been tough for you." She looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was wrong, and now I'm paying the price." Jamie took a moment to gather his thoughts. He remembered how his father, Principal Davis, had handled the situation with dignity and fairness, and how the school community had come together to support him. Inspired by that, Jamie decided to take action to help Mrs. Parker. "Listen," he began, his voice steady. "I understand that you made mistakes, but everyone deserves a second chance. My father is the principal, and he cares about making sure everyone has the opportunity to improve and move forward. Maybe there's something you can do here to help the school, and in return, we can help you." Mrs. Parker looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you really think that's possible?" Jamie nodded. "Yes, I do. Let me talk to my dad and see what we can do." With renewed determination, Jamie left the art room and made his way to his father's office. Principal Davis was busy with papers and phone calls, but Jamie approached him with a respectful knock on the door. "Come in," Mr. Davis said, looking up from his work. His warm brown eyes met Jamie's, filled with curiosity and support. "Dad, can I talk to you for a moment?" Jamie asked. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Principal Davis replied, motioning for Jamie to sit. Jamie took a deep breath. "I just saw Mrs. Parker. She's really struggling. I was thinking maybe we could find a way to help her. Maybe give her a job here, something manageable, so she can support herself." Principal Davis leaned back in his chair, contemplating Jamie's request. He was proud of his son's maturity and compassion. "I appreciate your concern, Jamie. It shows a lot of character to want to help someone who caused you pain. Let me think about it." Jamie nodded, understanding that it might not be an easy decision. "Thank you, Dad. I just believe that everyone deserves a chance to make things right." Later that evening, Principal Davis met with Jamie to discuss the proposal. He admired his son's empathy and the way he had approached the situation with such grace. "Jamie, I think your idea has merit," Principal Davis said thoughtfully. "Mrs. Parker clearly needs support, and offering her a position here could be beneficial for both her and the school. However, we need to ensure that this arrangement is respectful and appropriate for everyone involved." Jamie agreed wholeheartedly. "I understand. I just want to help her and make sure she's taken care of." The next day, Principal Davis arranged a meeting with Mrs. Parker. They sat in his office, the atmosphere tense but hopeful. Mrs. Parker looked nervous but determined, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and regret. "Mrs. Parker," Principal Davis began, "Jamie has brought a proposal to my attention. He believes that you could contribute to the school in a different capacity, perhaps with some manual labor or maintenance work. This would provide you with a steady income while also allowing you to stay connected to the school community." Mrs. Parker listened intently, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. I've made so many mistakes, and I don't deserve any kindness." Jamie spoke up, his voice firm yet gentle. "Everyone makes mistakes, Mrs. Parker. What matters is that you are willing to change and help us improve the school. My dad believes in second chances, and so do I." Principal Davis nodded in agreement. "We all believe in giving people the opportunity to grow and make amends. If you're willing to take on this role, we'd be happy to support you." Mrs. Parker looked between Jamie and Principal Davis, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. I won't let you down." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Parker began her new role as a janitor at Lincoln Middle School. The transition was challenging, both for her and for the students who had once feared her. However, Jamie's unwavering support and the school's inclusive policies made it easier for everyone to move forward. Jamie made an effort to include Mrs. Parker in school activities, ensuring she felt welcome and valued. He invited her to join the student council meetings, where she could share her experiences and learn from the new initiative. Slowly, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by a mutual respect built on understanding and forgiveness. One day, during a lunch break, Jamie found Mrs. Parker in the library, quietly tidying up bookshelves. He approached her with a warm smile. "Hi, Mrs. Parker. How's everything going today?" She looked up and returned his smile. "Much better, thanks to you and your dad. It's been a real adjustment, but I'm grateful for the chance to start over." Jamie nodded, feeling a sense of relief and happiness. "I'm glad to hear that. If you need anything, just let me know." As the months passed, Mrs. Parker's presence at the school became less of a reminder of past conflicts and more of a testament to the power of compassion and second chances. She developed a routine that balanced her new responsibilities with moments of reflection and growth. The students began to see her not as the strict teacher who had caused them fear, but as a member of their community who was striving to make amends. One chilly November morning, Jamie was walking down the hallway when he noticed Mrs. Parker outside the art room, carefully arranging decorations for the upcoming winter fair. He approached her, admiring the way she had poured her effort into making the event special for the students. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker." Jamie greeted her cheerfully. "Good morning, Jamie," she replied, smiling warmly. "I was hoping to get your input on these decorations. I want everything to look just right for the fair." Jamie took a closer look at her work, appreciating the attention to detail. "They look great. You've really captured the winter theme." Mrs. Parker nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Thank you. It's been a wonderful project to work on. I'm enjoying being part of the preparations." As they worked together, Jamie couldn't help but reflect on how far they had both come. The once tense relationship had transformed into one of mutual respect and friendship. Mrs. Parker had become a symbol of resilience and redemption, showing that even the hardest moments could lead to positive outcomes. One evening, as Jamie was finishing his homework, his father approached him with a thoughtful expression. "Jamie, I've been thinking about how well Mrs. Parker has adjusted to her new role. She's been a great asset to the school, and I believe we should recognize her efforts." Jamie looked up, curious. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I'm considering nominating her for the School Community Service Award," Principal Davis explained. "It's important to acknowledge the positive contributions she's made and the progress she's shown." Jamie felt a surge of pride and happiness. "That's a great idea, Dad. She deserves it." A few weeks later, the school held its annual award ceremony. The auditorium was filled with students, teachers, and parents, all gathered to celebrate the achievements and contributions of the school community. As the principal began to speak, Jamie felt a sense of anticipation. "And now, I would like to present the School Community Service Award to someone who has shown remarkable resilience, dedication, and a genuine desire to make our school a better place," Principal Davis announced. The crowd hushed as Mrs. Parker stepped forward, her eyes scanning the audience with a mix of nervousness and hope. Jamie stood proudly at his seat, his heart swelling with pride for the journey they had both undertaken. "Mrs. Parker," Principal Davis continued, "your commitment to improving our school environment and your willingness to embrace change have made a significant impact on our community. Your efforts in maintaining our facilities and contributing to school events have not gone unnoticed. We are grateful for your dedication and the positive example you've set for our students." Applause filled the room as Mrs. Parker accepted the award, her eyes glistening with tears. She approached the stage, and Principal Davis handed her the certificate. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady yet emotional. "This means more to me than words can express." I am grateful for the second chance you all have given me, and I promise to continue working hard to support our school and its students." Jamie watched her with admiration. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that his efforts to show compassion and forgiveness had helped transform not only Mrs. Parker's life, but also the entire school community. After the ceremony, Mrs. Parker approached Jamie with a warm smile. "Jamie, thank you for believing in me and for helping me find a way to contribute positively here. I couldn't have done it without your support." Jamie smiled back, feeling a genuine connection. "You're welcome, Mrs. Parker. I'm glad we could work things out." As the school year progressed, the bond between Jamie and Mrs. Parker grew stronger. She became a mentor to him and other students, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to pursue their goals with determination and kindness. The once divided classroom had become a place of unity and mutual respect, where everyone felt safe and supported. One sunny spring afternoon, as the school prepared for the final Unity Fair, Jamie and Mrs. Parker collaborated on a project that symbolized the harmony they had achieved. Together, they created a mural that depicted the journey of the school, from the dark times of discrimination to the bright future of inclusion and acceptance. The mural featured diverse students holding hands, surrounded by symbols of unity and strength. As they painted, Mrs. Parker shared stories of her own upbringing and the lessons she had learned from her mistakes. Jamie listened attentively, gaining a deeper understanding of her motivations and the challenges she had faced. Their conversations fostered a sense of healing and reconciliation, bridging the gap that had once existed between them. On the day of the Unity Fair, the mural stood proudly in the main hallway, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength of the human spirit. Students, teachers, and parents admired the artwork, marveling at the intricate details and the powerful message it conveyed. Jamie felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in creating something meaningful and enduring. As the sun sets on the last day of school, Jamie reflects on the incredible journey he has been on. He has grown not only as a student, but also as a compassionate and understanding individual. The challenges he has faced have taught him the importance of empathy, resilience, and the impact of positive action. As he walks home with his father, Jamie feels an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Dad, I am so proud of what we have accomplished this year. Helping Miss Parker has made a huge difference, not only for her, but for the entire school." Principal Davis smiles, placing her hand on Jamie's shoulder. "You have done an amazing job, Jamie. Your kindness and leadership have helped make our school a place where everyone feels valued and respected. I couldn't be more proud of you." When they got home, Jamie found Miss Parker waiting outside, holding a bouquet of flowers as a gesture of thanks. She approached them with a warm smile. "Jamie, Mr. Davis? Thank you both for everything. I feel like I've found a new purpose here, and it's all because of your support." Jamie handed her the flowers, his eyes shining with happiness. "You deserve it, Miss Parker. We're so glad you are here." Miss Parker hugged Jamie, tears streaming down Jamie's shoulders. The end?